Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carlos, and I'm a web developer based in Brooklyn, New York. And today we're going to work on a project called Express Publishing from the Build Web APIs from Scratch course. Now, this will be one of the last units for the course, so at this point, you should be quite comfortable with JavaScript fundamentals, how to create loops, how to write conditionals, how to write functions and pass them around. You should also know how to write modules and import them and export them into different files. You should be familiar with API designs and how to actually create an API. We're going to be using CRUD in this project, so you should be familiar with CRUD operations, which stands for create, read, update, and delete, which are the basic four functions for persistent storage. We're going to be working with the open source library called Express to handle all of our routes. So you should be comfortable knowing how to create routes, how to make GET requests, POST requests, how to send status codes. We're also going to be working with a database, and we're going to be using SQLite in order to instantiate a database and update data in order to persist into it. Now, a few requirements for this project is that we're going to be working on a local machine. So you should have your DB browser application downloaded. If you haven't done that yet, look back in the previous units, and there should be an article giving you instructions on how to actually download that. You should also have a text editor already set up, whether it's Sublime, Atom, or VS Code, or any other of your preference. That's okay. Just have one that's working and already set up on your computer. And you should also have a terminal. I'll be using iTerm for mine and VS Code as my text editor. If you have a different editor or terminal, that's totally fine. Pick one of your preference that's already set up on your computer. Okay, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started on the project. Okay, so in this project, we're going to be building a complete API using Express.js and SQLite for internal management tool for a comic book publishing company that's called Express Publishing. So let's go ahead and just get started with setting up a project. Okay, so for step one, we're going to go ahead and download and unzip the skeleton code for our project. And I'll have you also actually open it up on your text editor. So go ahead and do that, and then we can actually go ahead and explore what are the contents. Okay, for step two, we're going to navigate to the root directory using a terminal, and we're going to run npm install. So I'm going to be using the integrated terminal that's provided by VS Code, and I already have the project downloaded. So I have my text editor here, and I'm going to be using the terminal from the VS Code. So let's go ahead and run npm install to install all the packages. And you can look at your package JSON. Before, I forgot what version, but a few months ago, you actually had to run the flag --save in order for these packages to be installed into your package JSON. But now it's npm does it automatically, so you can simply call npm install, and that will add them to your dependencies right over here. Okay, so let that packages get installed. Wait a second. I'm gonna actually pause and wait for this to finish, and then I'll continue. Okay, so we've installed all the packages now, and let's move on to the next step. Okay, for step three, we're actually going to be setting up our server now. So let's go to the project's root directory, and let's create a file called server.js. So we're already in our project directory here in the terminal, so I'm simply going to create server.js, and we should have it right over here. Okay, it's looking good. Let's go up to step four. For step four, we're going to install and import the following packages: body parser, course, error handler, Morgan, and Express. And like I said earlier, when we install the packages, we have to ensure that they get saved to the dependencies and package JSON. In order to do that, you have to add --save when you install the package, but we don't need to do that anymore because Express npm does it automatically. So let's go ahead and install body parser, course, error handler, Morgan, and Express. We'll wait those to be installed from npm. Once again, I'm going to pause quickly so that I don't waste too much time, guys. Okay, the packages were installed successfully. Once they're installed, let's go ahead and actually import them into our server.js files. So we can import them by simply calling in require and passing in the actual package that we're going to be importing into the file. So we'll start out with body parser. So let's make a variable called body parser, and we'll import body parser. We're going to do the same with course. So require course. We'll do the same with error handler. Handler, require, error handler. Let's do it with Express as well. Okay, it's looking good. Go ahead and save that. And now we can move on to step 5. So in step 5, we're actually going to create an instance of the Express app and save it to a variable. So this will basically be the instantiation of our application. So I'm going to create a variable called app and then just simply call um, Express on it. So app equals Express. Okay, looking good. Now we can move on to the next step. So let's move on to step number 6. Okay, for step number 6, we're going to create a variable representing the port that our server will be listening on. And this should be able to be optionally set to process.environment.port if the value is already set for testing purposes. Otherwise, it should default to the port number of your choice. We're not going to be using 8081 though, because that is a port that was going to be used to test the files so they don't conflict with each other. So let's go back to our project here. I'm actually going to take out the project directory here. And let's create this variable. I'm going to do it right below our application variable here. So we're going to, out of convention, we usually type in ports as capital letters, all caps. And then we're going to make sure that if the port is set up in the environment already, then we're going to pass that in. And otherwise, if that's false and it doesn't exist, then we'll set a default to 4000. If you'd like to change the port number, that's totally fine. It's up to you. 4000 is a very common one, so I'll be using 4000 for this. So let's go ahead and check if process environment dot port exists. We'll set our port to that value. And if it doesn't exist, then we'll actually set it to 4000. Go ahead and save that. I'm going to clear our terminal here and actually minimize it because we don't need it for now, so you get a better picture of it. Okay, let's go ahead and save that, and then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, for step number 7, we're going to use body parser, JSON, error handler, and course middleware, the functions for all the routes in the server. Additionally, consider setting up Morgan logging to the dev setting for easier debugging. Okay, let's go to our project and we can set up the rest of our middleware functions. So in order to do that, we have to call .use on our application and pass in the middleware that we actually going to provide into it. So let's start out with body parser. We can do that by calling body app.use and pass in our body parser variable that we called. And we're going to pass in .json so that all the information that's being parsed into can be read as JSON and retrieved as JSON as well. Let's also grab our cores. So we call app.use and then pass in cores, and make sure you execute it as well. So cores just basically allows us to make allows others domains to actually make requests to our web API. It's mostly for a security purpose. Okay, let's also make sure that we have our error handler. So app.use error handler, and make sure you call it as well. And lastly, let's go ahead and set up Morgan. Morgan can take numerous options here. These are for login purposes, so if you get an error, Morgan kind of parses what request we made, and it kind of makes a nice little log in our terminal when we're actually hitting those APIs. Okay, it seems to be good. Let's move forward to step 8. So now we can start, we need to set up our port variable. So to start our server, we're going to use a port variable that we declared earlier, and we're going to add a callback function that will log out a useful message to the console once our server is running. So let's go back to the project here, and right at the end, let's start our server. We can call .listen and pass in a port, and then a callback function that will log in what port our server is being listened on. So let's go ahead and type in app.listen, pass in port that we're actually going to listen to, and this is the actual constant variable that we have at the top here, and then our callback function. So our callback function will be in charge of console logging where we're actually listening to. So I'm going to use a template literal here. You can use old string interpolation if you like. So I'm going to say listening on port, and then I'll pass in the actual port variable. So when we start our server, we will get this message on the terminal if our server is running successfully. So let's go ahead and save that, and we'll move forward to step number 9. So for step number 9, all we need to do is export our Express app. And this will be used for our test file as well. So let's go at the bottom right below, make sure you add your semicolons, and then type in module.exports.app equals app. So our module here, which is basically encapsulated code that can be specified in this single variable name, we'll be able to import this into different files or use it in the different sections of our project and actually have access to all this information that we have written out here. Okay, once you export it, let's move on forward to step 10, where we're actually going to start creating our API router. Okay, in step 10, since all the routes in this project have paths with starting with /API subpath, we're going to create an API router that will prepend this path segment. So let's go ahead and create a directory called API in the root directory of the project, and within that directory we're going to create a file called api.js. So let's go to our, let's open up the terminal again. We're in our project, make sure you're on the root directory. So let's create a folder called API, switch to that folder, and then just create an API.js file. So I'm going to clear the terminal again, and we'll close it up right now. And let's open our API file right here. So if you did it correctly, you should have your folder here at the top of your root project, and your API.js file should be inside it. Okay, let's close this out, and also make sure you're saving your files as you move on to different steps. So let's move forward to step 11. In step 11, within API.js, we're going to import Express and then create an instance of an Express router and save it to a variable. Okay, so first thing we need to do, I'll zoom in for a second. Let's create the Express, let's import Express. So let's create a variable called Express, and we'll equal to requiring Express, two S's here. And then we're going to create a router. So I'm going to call this the API router. So let's create a variable called API router and set it equal to, we're going to actually call the class method router on Express. So let's call router. So the router class is used to create modular and mountable route handlers that we're going to be using for specific API endpoints. So we notice that in here we're going to be using /API for all of our routes, for all of the initiation of our routes. So we can actually just call API router and actually set up our endpoints using the router class to make this a little easier and cleaner to write. Okay, let's move on to step 12 now, which we're simply just going to export the router. So same thing we did with our previous server app, the application itself. We just call module.exports and set it equal to API router. Okay, save that as well. And let's move on to step 13. In step 13, we're going to go to server.js, and then we're going to import the API router and mount it at all routes starting at API. So let's go into server.js, and let's import our actual API router. So let's do that right after our Express. So I'm going to call this API router, and we're simply going to require it as you got to navigate onto the right directory. So in the same folder, since we're in the source on the root project directory, we can simply go into API, and then we can go into the API.js file. So I'm not typing .js because API, the JavaScript file, is implicit when you require it. So now we actually imported the API router, and in order to use it, let's go ahead and pass it in right after we actually set up our cores here. Let's go ahead and set up our APIs to start off with a specific endpoint. So we can actually set whatever endpoint we'd like it to set up with. I'm going to specify we want it to start out with /API, and we're going to set that up with our API router. So this middleware is basically going to set up all our paths to start out with API, and our API router is actually going to be in charge of figuring out what to do with those routes and how to handle them. Okay, it's looking good. I'm going to also pass, I'm going to move the Morgan logging right around here. Remember, the way middleware works is it kind of trickles down through certain functions. So the way we're actually going to do error handling, we want this all the way at the bottom, just in case some of these routes have errors. We want them, and it doesn't like actually feed into the rest of their functions. We want it to trickle down into our error handler instead of having error handling at the bottom, because if that happens, then the router errors will not actually reach this middleware. So kind of the way we actually baby step into the middleware is kind of important. So make sure you have your error handling right here at the bottom, right after you set up your routers. Okay, save your file, and let's go on to step 14. Okay, finally we can start by creating our actual artist table. So remember, we're gonna working with like a comic book style application. So we're gonna be creating some tables to store certain comics, certain artists, and certain issues. So each issues will be made by certain artists. So to get the idea of how you're gonna actually um, create this application, it's good to have a clear idea of what we're gonna be building. So let's go ahead and we're gonna start by writing the artist table. So we're going to write code to create the artist table. So in the root directory, you're going to open migration.js. We're going to import SQLite 3, which should already be installed if you ran npm install at the beginning of your project. So let's go to our project here and see the project directory. If you check your package.json and you look at your dependencies, you should see that we have SQLite 3 installed right over here. So that is successful. If you don't have it there and if you don't see it, make sure you install it by running npm install. Okay, I'm going to get rid of my package.json file. Let's open our migration file actually. And in here we're going to import SQLite. So at the top of our file, let's call this SQLite 3. And let's go ahead and acquire it. There we go. And save your file. Okay, let's move on to the next step. So now we actually have to open the database SQLite file as a SQLite 3 database object, and then we save that to a variable. So if you look in our project, there should be an actual database SQLite file that we have here, database.sqlite. What we need to do is basically create an instantiation of the database class, which is attached to SQLite 3 package. And then we need to actually set up our file, which is database.sqlite. So all of our tables will be stored in this specific database table. So we're going to be using DB browser to actually navigate to the table and see what's being imported there. So let's save that in the variable called const db, which stands for database, and let's start creating a new instantiation of SQLite3.database. So in order to do that, we have to actually start it with a new keyword, and it's going to open up database. And we got to specify what folder. Make sure you navigate to the right folder. If this would be in a folder like database files, you'd have to actually go to that folder. But since we're in the root directory and it's in the same file, we can actually just go into that same path. So database.sqlite. Okay, let's go ahead and save that and move on to the next step, 16. So now we're going to create our database first table. So on the database object, we're going to run a SQLite command to create an artist table if it doesn't already exist with the following schema. So we have an ID, which will be the primary key, the name, the date of birth, biography, and a boolean here, an integer, sorry, that is currently employed that will have a default to 1. So before we actually create the table, we want to actually call .serialize on the database because we want to have a certain sequential order of how we're going to be running our database when we instantiate, when we run migration. Let's say you create a table and you update it, and it's not in the serialize function. You might be updating it before it's even created. So we actually want to create a table first and have a sequential order for these SQL tables. So let's go ahead and run .serialize with on our database, and this will take a callback function. Now inside our callback function, here is where we can run our SQL queries. So we're going to start out by running db.run, and here we're going to specify what we want on this table. So we're going to want to create a table. Our SQL query will be create table if not exist. Now for identifiers on SQL, there's many ways you can write it. In Node SQL.js, you can actually use backticks to specify what are the name of the table, what are the name of the rows, amongst other information. So let's go ahead and call this table artist. We're going to open up a parentheses to continue this and make sure you add a new line. And inside, right below it, we're going to add in the rest of our rows here. So our row, the first row will be an ID. Make sure you use your backticks for that as well. It will be an integer that's not null. And then let's go on to a new row. Let's call this row name. Make sure you use lowercase. This will also be a text, and it will be not null. We have also date of birth, biography, and is currently employed. So let's go on to the next line. We're going to use date of birth. Again, make sure you use lowercase, date of birth. This will be text and it's required, so it can't be null, not null. Let's add is currently unemployed. Is currently employed, sorry. Employed. And this will be an integer that's not null, and it defaults to 1. So all you need to do is type in default, which will be a keyword that SQL knows how to interpret. And we'll add the last primary key. We got to specify what is a primary key, and that will be the ID. So all we need to do is pass in primary key and pass in the ID as a primary key. Then we can simply close in our parentheses. Make sure you close in the parentheses for your db.run function. I think I have an extra parentheses here. There we go. Okay, so let's see if we got everything. ID, name, date of birth. I think we're missing biography. I'll do that right after our date of birth here as well. So let's go ahead and add biography as well. Biography. And this will be text, not null. Let's make sure we go ahead and add a new line. Okay, that's looking good. I've also noticed right here that we actually have Morgan, but we haven't imported Morgan yet, since it wasn't it was an optional actual middleware that we could have imported. So I'm gonna go ahead and import Morgan as well at the top of our server.js file. So Morgan equals require Morgan. Go ahead and save that, and then we can move on to step 17. Okay, for step 17, once we finish running the migration, we're going to run node migration in the terminal, and then we're going to go onto our DB browser, and we're going to open database SQLite, kind of test out the actual table, and make sure it's ready. And once it's ready, we can run npm test to check that the artist table is passing. Okay, so I'm going to go to a new window here. I'm going to open up my DB browser for SQLite. And then let's open up our database. So let's go ahead and click on database. I'm gonna go to my project here, and we're gonna open our SQLite file here, and this should load up our actual table. So now to test if our table actually is able to insert values into it, we're gonna go into our browse data tab over here. We're on the artist table, and actually you can look at the structure of your table here by just expanding the little tab. You'll see we have an ID as our primary key with the little key icon there and the name, date of birth, biography, and another is currently employed. You see that we have our types, and you see the actual query we use to create this table. But if we want to try inserting stuff into it, we can go into this table and we can try a new record and specify what record we're going to type. So Carlos, date of birth is February 3, 1990, biography, amateur artist, currently employed, and this is actually able to create the record. So everything seems to be working fine. You see that we have the rows, the date of birth, and we can delete this. And we can, after this seems everything okay for you, if you actually notice that you have all the rows. Let's go back to our project. Let's open up the terminal, and we can just simply run npm test and run our test. There's about 50, maybe more tests open up right now, and we see there's a couple of artist tests for our artists that are failing. There's a reason for that. I have an idea that what might be the issue. So let's scroll and go up to our artist table here, and you see we have a very nice error message here that says our database is locked. So that means our actual database is being used right now. So go ahead and exit your DB browser for SQLite. I'm not going to save anything right now because I don't want to actually persist any data that I actually used for the example. Let's go ahead and run npm test again and see if our table is now passing. Okay, so it didn't pause. Let's go ahead all the way up. And now we have 9 tests passing as opposed to 4, I think it was the previous one. So we have all our tests passing for our artist table now, which means we successfully created our first table with SQLite. Okay, that at least seems to be good. I'm going to clear my terminal once again and minimize it for now. And let's go back to our project now and move on to step 18, where we're actually going to start creating our routes. Okay, let's move on to step 18. Okay, for step 18, let's go ahead and we're going to go up to our API directory, and we're going to create a file called artist.js. And within that file, we're going to import Express. and create an express router and export the router as well, just as we did with the other file. So let's go back to our project right over here, and I'm going to open the terminal. Let's navigate to the root directory. I'm already there. So let's go back to the API directory, and then we're going to touch a new file here, and it's be called artists.js. Once we've created it, let's go ahead and navigate to artist.js and just double check that it's in the right directory. We are in the API. Inside the API, we have API.js and then artist.js. So it looks to be fine. Then in here, we're going to import Express, just like we've done in the other files. Let's require it, Express. And then we're going to create a router, which we're basically going to be mounting our routes for the artists onto with this API. So we're going to call this variable artist router, and we're going to call the router class on Express. So express.router, make sure it's a capital R because we're talking about a class, and then go ahead and save that. Okay, let's move on to step 19. In step 19, we're going to import the artist router and mount it at artist/artists. Oh, and don't forget to export your router as well. So module exports equals artists router, artists router. Okay. So in step 19, we're going to go to app.js and import the artist router and mount it at artist. So let's go back to API.js. We need to first import our artist router. So const artist router, artists router will be equal to, we're going to import the actual file. So we have to navigate there. Since we're in the same directory of our APIs, we can simply just go into the same folder and then go into artists. Let's make sure we specify JS in this case. And how do we mount it? Well, we can simply call .use on the API router because we already have an instantiation of API router, and we can specify how we're going to label the endpoints and what router we're going to be using. So let's go ahead and call API router.use, and what are we going to be using for our route endpoints will be artists, and all the route handling for those endpoints will be done with our artist router. Okay, go ahead and save that, and then we can move on to step 20. Okay, for step 20, we're going to go into our artist.js file, and then we're going to import SQLite, and we're going to create an instance of our database file, and then we're going to load that database and check if there is a test database already and it has been set, and if so, we're going to load that database instead. So this will be due to our testing. We have some testings database tables there that we actually already filled in. So if that database exists already, we're going to be using that. Otherwise, we're going to create a new one. And let's go ahead and actually go into our project here. Let's move on to artists. Okay, so back here, we first have to import our SQLite package. So const SQLite 3 will equal to require SQLite 3. After that, we want to create, similar to what we did in, I believe was our API or server, we actually created a new database. Oh, and migration actually. If we go to migrations, we created a new database file here. Now we can do the same thing, but we actually have to create, make sure that we use an optional of our process of our test database. So we can grab this actual line, and let's go back to artists here. And instead of just using this database, we're actually going to pass in an optional process.end.test database. So process.end.test database. So if that's been set, we're going to be using that database to actually run our testing. Otherwise, we're going to be creating an actual table that we used with migrations. So let's save that as well, and we can move forward to step 21. For step 21, we are going to add a get handler to the router for the first slash path, and this will be mounting at API artist. So there's no need to add all of the boilerplate for the artists. Let's go back to our project here. So like I said, we're already mounting. If we look into our server here, into our API.js, we're already mounting our router here for artists. So anything that we pass in our artist router here will be prepended with /artist. So any kind of, if we type in slash in here in the routing handler, it will be actually prepended by artist. So our first get handler will be essentially to get all the artists as well. So all we're going to do with starting out is not in API.js, sorry, in artist.js. We're going to go ahead and type in artist router. We're going to do our get method, and we're going to do it in the first slash index here. So this will be actually delivering and directing us to slash artist, because we're actually mounting all this router inside our API.js with this namespace here. So the next parameter for our get function here will be our request, our response, and our next parameters. This will be a callback function, so this code will be executed once we hit this endpoint. I'm going to get rid of this comment here. Make sure you have the colon here. Okay. So this route handler will have access to the request object, the response object, and the next object. So the next will be used as a last middleware function. So if we go to server.js, when we go to and we type in next into any of the route handlers, it will kind of trickle down to whatever paths we're going on to. So let's say we go and make a get request here, and there is nothing to get request, or there's an error console logged. Our code will basically go into our server.js file and notice that, hey, this route is actually not working. So it will go into the next middleware function, which we're doing as error handler. So this makes sense because this is why we put in error handler afterwards, because it will trickle down with the next keyword. So next will basically execute the next middleware that's located in our server.js file. Okay, let's move on to the next step, which is step 22. In step 22, we're going to create a get handler, which will execute a SQLite 3 query that will retrieve all the entries in the artist table that are currently employed, or where the row is currently employed is equal to 1, and this will retrieve all currently employed artists. So let's go back to our project here. Now we need to actually write a SQL query in this case, and the way we're going to do that is by calling our DB and calling .all function. So .all will enable us to actually retrieve a certain amount of rows, and it will take a callback function as a second parameter, which will have a way to actually control if there was an error, and how to actually manage what we will do with the result set if it was able to retrieve anything from the query itself. So let's go ahead and type db.all, and in here we're going to type in our query request. So how do we select? What we want to grab is all the artists from the artist table where they're currently employed, where the is currently employed row is equal to 1. So let's go ahead and type that query. We're going to select everything. We're going to use asterisk in this case, from the artist table, where artist dot, and we can access the row itself, currently employed, is equal to 1. And then the second parameter will be the callback function. I'm going to type this in a new row here so we have a little more space. It will take two parameters. This callback function will take the error, which will be the first parameter from the callback function, and it will also take the result set from the SQL query, which we know it will be rows containing artists. So in this function, we'll execute certain code that will control what we're going to do with the artist table if it was able to retrieve it, and if there was an error, we're going to figure out what we'll do with the error. So let's go ahead and save that as well and move on to the next step. Okay, so within the callback query that we just wrote, we're going to check if there is an error, and if there is an error, we're going to pass it along the middleware chain to be dealt with by error handler. Otherwise, we're going to send a response containing a JSON body with a key of artist and a value of the retrieved artist along with the status code of 200. So when we think our API artist get route is ready, we're going to run the test suite and check our work. So let's go ahead back into our query. Now I kind of already did some modification here earlier because I kind of foreseen that this might have been something that we're going to overlook. So I put the error handler all the way at the bottom. So all we need to do for this case, in case there is an error, we can simply pass in, let's write a conditional first. So if there is an error, what we need to do is simply call next and then pass in that error. So this error will be passed into the error handler middleware that we have in our server.js. So let's say we are here. We go and access our API router, which is part of the API. Our API router is using the artist slash endpoint, which is controlled by the artist router middleware. And in here, we're doing the query. So if this error is found in this query, it will trickle down all the way up to our server file and all the way up here, and it will stop the execution of the function here and fall into this middleware. So if it stops and it finds an error, the error will be sent to the next middleware function, which is error handler. So the error handler will actually control what to do with the error, and it's a good middleware function to actually log out what the error was and what happened there. Okay, so we're able to actually pass in the error into the middleware function. Let's do an else statement here. What if we actually retrieve information? So we have to actually, in order to do that, we want to pass in a status code of 200, meaning that it was a success. So we're going to pass in into the response object status. We're going to attach a 200 status code. And we're also going to chain in a .json call containing an object here. And we want that object to contain information from all the artists. So we're going to have the key property of artists, and the value will be artist as well. Now, if you're using ES6, you can technically just type in artist, and if you have the same key and value name, it will ES6 is smart enough to know that it will be this will be the key and the same value as well. But in this case, to make it a little easier and clearer for everyone, I'll keep the key property and value name here as well. Okay, so let's move on, and we can actually start running our test now. So let's open up our terminal and type in npm test, and we see we have a bunch of other tests failing. So let's scroll a little further up and see if we're able to get our get request for the artist endpoints. So let's scroll up here. Okay, we see that we have few tests passing for the table. That's still going good, and we have our get API artist. So we have successfully gotten a 200 that returns all currently employed artists, and we return a status code of 200. So that seems to be working well. Perfect. We can move on forward. I'll clear the terminal as well and move on to the next step. Okay, let's move on to step 24. So in step 24, our get, put, and delete route paths will have an artist ID parameter. So for both, we will have to check that the artist has with an ID exist, and if it doesn't, we're going to send a 404 response. So let's add a router parameter to this to reduce the boilerplate. So we're going to call this router parameter artist ID, and we're going to set that to the artist router here. So we're going to do that all the way at the top so we can actually use it into the other routers as well. So we're going to be using something that's called basically param. This is basically a function call that we do on our application here. So anytime there's a given string, in our case will be the artist ID, that's present in the URL pattern of the route, which for us is /artist/artist ID, then the server receives a request that matches that route, and the callback to app.param will be triggered. So in this case, we're actually going to specify what we want our param to contain. So what we're going to do, what we're going to name this parameter, and how we're actually going to execute function with that parameter. So let's go to the top here. Actually, I'm going to delete this comment here, and we'll start writing it on our artist router. So artist.router, dot param will take a few values. First, it will be take the name of the actual placeholder or the parameter that we're going to be passing into it. So we're going to be calling it artist ID. Then it will take a callback function, and this callback function will take numerous things. First, we're going to get the usual request object, response object, and the next middleware function as well. And then we're going to get the artist ID, but in this sense, it will be the actual value. So when we see pass in the parameter in the URL, this will be the name parameter, the placeholder. In this case, we're actually going to have the value of that placeholder. So if someone types in /artist/4, the artist ID will be 4, and then we're going to execute something with that parameter. So we're doing this as a way to keep our code dry and in order to use it in numerous routes as well. So in case we're going to fetch an artist ID in numerous routes, all we can do is simply create this param function, and it will retrieve information on that artist ID as opposed to doing the SQL query on every single route that needs to grab the artist ID. So let's move on to step 25. So within this artist param callback, we're going to execute a SQL query, which will get the artist with a given ID. So a few things to run this SQL query. First, we actually need to write the query itself. And we're going to be using named parameters for a SQL query because we don't really know the artist ID until someone actually types in the URL itself. So let's type in the SQL query, and we're going to type in select everything from the artist table where the artist.id is equal to, now there's numerous ways to actually write name parameters in SQL. You can use an @ sign, You can use a colon, but in this case, it's just easier to do a $sign because @ and colons are saved for certain JavaScript declarations or expressions, and you need to escape them. For a $sign, we don't need to escape them, so it's just easier to type and a lot faster to actually go through. So our name parameter will be artist ID, and now we actually have to give the value of that parameter. So where are we going to grab the value of that parameter? Well, we have it set up here in our argument here for the callback function. So let's define the value in an object, which will basically have this as a property, and the value will be the actual value itself, which is artist ID. So we're going to pass in an object with a key property as the named parameter, so it's artist ID, and the value will be the artist ID without the $sign, which is referring to the actual parameter from the callback function. Once we have the SQL query and the values, we can actually execute the SQL query by calling .get on our database. We use .get because .get will retrieve a single row. If we wanted to retrieve numerous rows, we could use db.all like we did for our artist router for the slash parameter, slash artist parameter. So let's go ahead and on new line, type in db.get, and db.get will take in a SQL query, and if they're named parameters, the second parameter will be the values for those parameters, and then lastly, we'll take a callback function. So let's type in the SQL query we're going to be passing into it. Since the SQL query has one named parameter called artist ID, we need to pass in the values. So it will look into the artist ID parameter and be like, what is that? And we have our value right there. And lastly, we will take a callback function. And this callback function has two parameters. The first one is always the error. And then the next one is the artist itself. In this case, it will be the row that we're retrieving, which is an artist. Okay, that's it for this step. Let's go to step 26 now. For step 26, within the callback function we just wrote, we're going to be sending any SQL errors down the middleware chain, so to our error handler, for example. Otherwise, we're going to check if an artist was retrieved. And if it was retrieved, then we're going to attach it to the request object as artist and move to the next function in the middleware chain. If it wasn't, then we're going to send a 404 response. Okay, so first thing we need to do, we got to check if there is an error. So we can use an if statement here. So we'll check if there is an error. And if there is an error, we can simply just pass that error into our next middleware function. So for our case, it will be the error handler middleware that we already specified in our server.js file. So we're going to pass that error there. Error. There we go. Otherwise, first we gotta check if there's an artist that was able to be retrieved. So we're gonna use else if there is an artist retrieved. If there's an artist retrieved, we're gonna attach that artist to the request object, and we're gonna name that object artist. So we're gonna create a new object in our request object called artist, and we'll set that equal to the artist row that we actually just retrieved. And after that, we have to always remember to type in next to pass it into the next middleware or route handler actually. If you don't do that, this will be stopping and it will give you an error, basically will not go into the actual route. Remember, we're creating this almost like a handy function so that whenever there is an artist ID parameter in a URL, we can simply call this function here, this middleware function, and it will be able to retrieve us information about the artist ID parameter. So if we have, say we have 3 parameters that use artist ID, instead of writing all this on each of those routes, we can simply call this middleware function, and it'll be able to retrieve the data in itself. So last thing we need to do is to make sure if there is no artist retrieved, we have to return a status code of 404. So lastly, let's type in else statement at the bottom, and let's go ahead and send a status of 404, and at your semicolon here, it's that one right there as well, and go ahead and save that. Okay, now we can move on to step 27. So once we already have our artist ID parameter set up, now we're ready to write our get handler for this specific route. So whenever our route gets this name parameter, then that's when our param function will be called. So once it sees this, it will know that it will have to actually seek information about the artist. Okay, so now we can write our actual API artist/artist ID handler. We're going to register another get handler for the above path segment, and our router parameters should already handle all of the necessary SQL and error handling logic and attach the retrieved artist at request.artist. So within the handler's callback function, we're going to return a 200 response with a JSON body containing a key of artist and a value of the retrieved artist. And whenever we think that our handler is ready, we can just run our test and check our work. Okay, let's go back into our application here. So let's go below our main API slash artist route handler because we don't want it to get confused with the other route handler. And we're going to type in artists router dot get. Now the parameter for this path segment, we already have this attached to our API, and we already have this attached to the artist router. So all we need to do is specify the artist ID, and we can just simply type that in with a slash here and artist ID. So whenever our URL sees that, it will already execute this parameter little handy function. So we don't need to write any of this code inside that router to retrieve the SQL query. So we're still going to pass in our request, a response in our next middleware functions here as a callback. And all we need to do is if this was successful, if this parameter was successful and it retrieved an artist, there will be an artist object in the request object. So we simply can just pass that into the response object. There's a lot of objects, I know. We're going to pass in first a status code of 200, and then we can chain a JSON response to that to send to the client. That will be an artist, will be the name of the property. And since we grabbed the parameter and attached the retrieved artist from the SQL query inside here, we can simply grab that from the request object that we have from that handler here. So all we need to do is pass that in. Okay, looks good. Go ahead and save that. And let's run our test. So let's open up the terminal here. Let's run npm test. Let's have all the other tests go through. You'll see that there's a bunch of other tests that we're going to go over. Scroll the way up to the top here, and we're looking for a get for artist slash ID here. So here we go. We have our describe block for the get artist ID. So we're able to return the artist for the given ID. We're able to return a 200 status codes for valid IDs. And if it doesn't find a valid ID, we return a 404 for the status codes for those. Okay, those are looking good. So let's clear the terminal, minimize it as well, and let's move forward. Okay, let's move on to step 28. We're actually going to start writing post requests to our artist handlers. For step 28, our artist post handler for the slash path segment, we're going to do some kind of validation there. In the callback function of this handler, we're going to check that certain required fields are present. Because remember, we created a table, and that table had some required fields that could not be null. And those include the name, the date of birth, and the biography. So if any of those are not included in the post request, if they don't send information of those, then we're going to send a 404 status code. So let's go back in over here, and let's go below our artist ID get function, and let's write a post request for the slash segment. So artist router again dot post. Let's do a slash over here. We're going to pass our go to middleware functions here, parameter, in the callback function. And inside here, we're going to do our validation checking. It's not exactly validation checking, we just want to make sure that they exist. So we're going to check first that the name exists, so const name, and we're going to have an artist object here that's being trickled down from the actual main path there. So we first want to check if there is a name attached to the request body.artist. So request body.artist.name. So imagine someone fills out a form, and that form has a name of artist. So that's essentially what's happening here. Whenever someone fills out a form, that form might have a name tag. It's called artist, and that name tag will be attached to the request body. So we got the name. We want to check also the date of birth. So let's go ahead and type in a variable called date of birth. It will be equal to the body artist's date of birth. Minus sign here. Let's do there. And lastly, we want to check for the biography. Set that equal to request body.artist.biography. Okay, looking good. Now we want to check if any of those don't exist, and then we're going to send a status code of 400. So we can do that with a simple conditional here. So let's do if any of those don't exist, we can do that by checking if name does not exist or date of birth doesn't exist. Remember, we're doing or because if at least one of them doesn't exist, then we send a status code. We don't want to check if all of them don't exist. It will only take one of those for not to exist to send a status code of 400. So date of birth, if that doesn't exist, we'll send a 400, and lastly with biography. If none of those exist, if one of those doesn't exist, we return a status code of 400. Okay, looking good. Let's move on to the next step. Okay, for step 29, we're going to check to see if currently employed was set on the request artist object. If not, we're going to set it to 1. So that will simplify our SQL logic in the next step. That'll make more sense in a second. So right below our biography variable, let's create one for is currently employed, because that was essentially what our table was checking for. If it's currently employed, we're going to default it to 1. So is currently employed. That is not the right name. Let me retype this here. Is currently employed. So we're going to use a ternary operation here. So first, let's check if it exists in the request.body.artist object. Is currently employed. So if it does exist and it's equal to 0, then we'll set that. We'll give that value back. And if it doesn't exist, meaning if it's not there or if it's not 0, then we'll set it to 1 itself. Okay, let's move on to step 30. For step 30, we're going to execute a SQL query to create a new artist with the supplied attributes. So let's say the person filled out a form, the user filled out a form, and all the information that's necessary is valid and it was found. So now we actually have to create a SQL query and execute that SQL query in order to insert information to our table. So let's start out, let's break it down into steps. Let's first write our SQL query. So I'm going to store that in a variable called SQL. And I'm going to call this query by inserting into the artist table. We're going to pass in what we're going to be inserting, and we're going to pass in named parameters because we don't really know the values of the parameters until they're actually sent to the request object. So we're going to insert into artist. What are we going to be inserting? Name, date of birth, and make sure you're actually using I think it's called snake case. Because the name of the rows is what we're actually passing in here. The variable names will be passing in as name parameters with the $sign as values. But if we're actually specifying where we're going to be inserting information into, you got to make sure that it's the same format as it was in the table itself. Okay, so date of birth, biography, and is currently employed. Let's go ahead and close that parentheses on a new line here, just so it makes it a little easier to read. Then let's add in the values. So now we're going to specify what values we're going to be passing in here. So we're going to use name parameters, and just like we did before, we're going to use the $sign to actually label them as name parameters. So date of birth, biography, and is currently employed. Looking good. Now we have to specify what those values are. So we gotta create, let's create an object that's called values, where we specify what these values are for all these name parameters. So for name, we're gonna be passing a name. For date of birth, we're gonna be passing in date of birth. And these are all the variables we have over here that we grabbed from the actual request object. We have biography, will be biography. We have is currently employed, which is currently employed. There we go. Okay, good. And now we have to actually execute the SQL query. So we can do that by calling db.run and look back into your the way we actually wrote these kind of like formats. The way we run our SQL queries will be kind of similar here. So we're going to call db.run. We're going to pass in the SQL query, the values, and then a callback function. And this callback function will take in an error as a parameter. So we're going to figure out what we're going to do with the error. Now keep in mind that .run does not actually retrieve the row itself. It just executes some SQL queries. So we actually have to retrieve, if we want to grab that artist and say that we actually send a post request and we want to show the artist as well or give information about the artist that we just created, this will just execute the SQL query. If we want to retrieve that artist, we actually have to run another SQL query. So first we have to just run the SQL query in order to update our table, and then we can do some error handling there. But that's it for this step. Let's go ahead and save the file. Let's go ahead and move on to step 31. So in the callback function of this SQL query, we're going to check for errors and pass them down in the middleware chain. So if there are no errors present, we're going to retrieve the newly created artist from the database to return it in the response. Now we can use SQLite 3 has an attribute called last ID, which basically retrieves the last inserted row in that table. And we're going to write a SQL query to retrieve the new artist from the database. So like I said, dbrun just executes a query. It doesn't actually retrieve information. After we actually run that query, we're going to send the response body with a 201 status code. And when we think our post route is ready to be executed and run, we can just run our test and check if it's passing. So let's go back to our callback function and let's go ahead and first handle the error. So let's type in an error if statement here, and we'll pass in an error here to see if it exists. If it exists, we simply pass it into our middleware, the next middleware function, which will be our error handler. Otherwise, we have to actually first run another query which retrieves the row or the last inserted row. So we could do that with db.get. So db.get will give us a row, and I'm going to use string interpolation here. So in order to use the last ID attribute, so we start out. You can use template literals or string interpolation with a plus sign or whatever you'd like. I'm going to use the template literals over here. So we'll do select everything from artist where artist.id. Now, how do we specify what is the ID of the last inserted row? But like I said, we have the last ID attribute. Now we can't just pass last ID like that. We actually have to specify to the last query that from our callback function here. So this will refer to the last inserted row, and it will grab the ID from that. The next thing from this db.query callback function, we have to pass in the parameter. After the first one will be a callback function, which will handle if there is an error and if there was a row retrieved. So first it will handle the error, and if there is no error, we'll see if there is an artist retrieved, and we can just simply return that artist to our client here. So we have to pass in a status code of 200 and then attach our response, an object to the response body as well. So let's go ahead and first attach the status code, which will be 201. So rest.status will be 201. And then let's call another JSON method here. And let's attach an artist object, which will have the value of the artist row that we just retrieved. So once again, we're creating a post request. We're grabbing information from the request body that has a name, the date of birth, the biography. We're checking if he's currently employed. If any of these values are not present, or one of those values is not present, then we're going to stop the execution of that function and send a status code of 400. Otherwise, we're going to set up a SQL query to be ran, and we're going to assign the values, the name parameters, to the values that were retrieved, and then we're going to run that query. So if we run the query and there is an error perhaps in the query, then we're going to grab the error and send it to the next middleware function. Otherwise, the query will be run, it will update the table, and then we can actually run another query that will select the last inserted row for that artist and retrieve that artist if it is inserted successfully. Okay, so let's go back here and check what we need to do. We have to run the test now. So let's go back to our project. Let's open up our terminal here and let's type in npm test and then run our test and see what we get here. So let's go all the way up here and see if our testing for our post request to artist is passing. That's serious. And here we go. So we have for the endpoints of API artist, we're able to create a valid artist. We're able to send a status code after the artist was created. And we're able to return the newly created artist after artist creation. And then we set the new currently employed by default, which is 1. And then we return a 400 status code for the invalid artist. Okay, that seems to be working, so we're doing good so far, guys. Let's minimize the terminal and we can move on to the next step. Let's resume learning. Okay, let's go on to step 32 over here. So now we're going to add a put handler on the artist ID to our router. We're going to check to ensure all required fields are present in the request body, and if they're not, then we're going to send a 400 response code. Okay, let's go back to our project here for the artists. So quite similar to what we did right here, where we kind of assured that we had the right values for the artist. If we're updating an artist, we want to make sure that their values are present as well, because we can't update something that doesn't exist. So let's go ahead and type in artist router dot put. We're going to do it for the specific artist ID. So make sure you have the colon as there as well, artist ID, and then we'll pass our callback function with a request response in our next functions here. And inside here, we're going to do some error checking. So just like we did over here, I can actually copy and paste all this code because we're going to check if there is a name, if there is a date of birth, biography, and if he's currently employed as well. So we can just grab that and paste that in here since the code is exactly the same. And go ahead and save that, and then we can move on to the next step. Okay, step 33. We're going to execute a SQL statement to update the artist with a supplied artist ID to have a supplied updated attribute. So now we actually have to create another SQL query here in order to update the artist that we actually passed in. So again, this is quite similar to the creation of an artist. So I'm going to go back down here and create a variable called SQL, which will be the SQL query that we're going to be executing. So let's go ahead. We're going to update the artist table. And how do you update an artist table? Well, you set certain rows by their name parameters here. So we're going to set the name to be equal to the name parameter. We're going to be actually giving the value of these variables to that name parameter. We're also going to be setting the date of birth to be equal to date of birth. And lastly, I'm going to make a new line over here so we have more space. We're going to set up the biography to be equal to the name parameter biography. And we're going to type in is currently employed to be equal to name parameter is currently employed. Let's do one last line. And we're going to do this in what specific ID? Now we got to specify what artist we're going to update. So we're going to add our where clause, and we're going to specify the artist ID with the name parameter artist ID, which we're retrieving from the actual request body artist. Remember, we have this parameter here that will retrieve the actual information of the artist and attach it to the request artist. Let's go back down here. Okay, now we're going to specify the values. So we're going to type in another values object here, and we're going to give the values of these variables that we wrote at the top of our route handler. So name will be equal to name. Date of birth will be set to date of birth. Our biography will be biography. Our is currently employed will be is currently employed. Our artist ID will be not artist ID. We can just grab it from the request.params artist ID. Remember, we have the params, which was from the actual URL. So whenever we have a parameter over here, that's exactly we can simply call params, and it will retrieve whatever's written in the URL. So we can grab that because we're not grabbing information; we're simply grabbing what is written on the URL itself. So we type in rec.params.artistid. If we were to write something like potatoes here or whatever, we can type in rec.params.potatoes, and it will give us the value from that URL. Let's add a semicolon here again. Okay. Now we got to run this SQL query. So let's call db.run. We're going to pass in the SQL query. We're going to pass in values, and then we're going to pass in error. And in here, we're going to do some callback. We're going to do some error handling for that. Okay, let's move on to step 34. Okay, in the callback function of the update statement, we're going to pass any errors down the middleware chain if they're present. Otherwise, we're going to retrieve the newly updated artist from the database and send it in the response with the 200 status code. So when you think our put route is ready, we're going to run the testing suite and check our work. So quite similar once again as a post request handler, we're first going to have to check if there is an error. And then we're going to pass it into our error handler middleware. And if there isn't an error, we're going to execute another SQL query to retrieve the artist, because dbrun, once again, doesn't retrieve a row. It just runs and executes a SQL query. So we can call db.get, and we're going to pass in a template literal here, because we need the actual rec params artist ID value. So select everything from artist where artist.id is equal to, and here we're going to pass in the actual string, which is given from the URL. So rec params.artistid. and then we can pass in another callback function as a second parameter. This callback function takes two parameters, error and artist. And here we have to actually send, if we actually retrieved, was able to create and update an artist, we can send a status code of 200. So response.status 200, and then send a JSON object as well with key property of artist and the same named value. Okay, let's go ahead and save that. I'll add my semicolons as well here. Okay, so now let's run our test. Make sure you saved your file. Let's open up the terminal here and run npm test. And you should scroll up and look up on your put tests. It should be all the way up down here right after our posts. And here we go. We see that we were able to update the artist with a given ID. We're able to return a 200 status code after the artist update. And we were able to return the updated artist after the artist update. We also were able to send a 400 status code if there was an invalid artist update. Okay, this is looking good. We gotta go ahead and make sure we're doing the CRUD operation. So we're able to right now do create an artist. We're able to read an artist, and we're able to update one. We're still not deleting one, so we're gonna be doing that in the next few tasks. Okay, let's go ahead and go on to step 35. Okay, so finally we can do the last step of our CRUD operations. We're gonna do delete. So we're gonna add a delete handler, and this will be slightly different than our normal delete. Instead of deleting an artist, we're just gonna mark them as unemployed, and we're gonna add a delete handler to the artist ID parameter. And within that handler's callback function, we're gonna do a few similar things that we've been doing. We're gonna run a SQL query, update the artist with a supplied ID so that he's not unemployed. Then we're going to send some errors, handle them, send successfully updated artist with 200 response codes. And when we think our delete is ready, we can run our test suite again. Okay, let's go back to our project here. We're going to run this after our update. Okay, let's scroll back down here. So let's start out by calling .delete on our artist router. Delete. We're going to pass in the parameter since we're going to be specifying a specific artist. And then we're going to pass in the callback function with our, obviously, rec, res, and next, and executing certain code with that callback function. So what we need to do, we're going to update an artist to that was currently employed to 0. So let's go ahead and type in a variable called SQL and update that artist. So update artist. We're going to set the is currently employed row is currently employed to 0, and we got to specify what artist, so we can just say where artist.id is equal to artist ID is the name parameter, and now we have to specify what is the artist ID parameter, its value. So just like we've been doing, we'll set an object here. We'll set the artist ID name parameter for SQL as the key property, and we will set the rec.params artist ID as its value since we can retrieve it from the URL. So now we need to execute a code. We're going to use db-run to execute and update the table. So db.run will take in the SQL query, the values for the name parameters, and a callback function, which will be the error handling. Let me add some space here. Inside here, we have to check if there is an error. If there is an error, we're going to pass that into our next middleware function. Otherwise, we're going to run another query to retrieve the updated artist or the one deleted. Once again, we're not retrieving a deleted artist because we're not deleting the artist from the table. We're just updating him so he's not employed. So we can call in db.get, and we're going to pass in the query itself. We're going to select all from the artist where artist.id is equal to, what is the ID? Well, rec params.artist.id, and this will take a callback function as well. This callback function will have an error in artist parameter, and make sure that this is the right order because the error will always be the first parameter. If you type artist here, it will still interpret it as error, so make sure you type in error, and artist will be the second parameter, which would be the row that was been successfully updated. Okay, so if we're able to actually retrieve an artist, we can send a status code of 200, and attach a JSON object with a key property of artist and the artist himself. So let me just fill out semicolons here. Just make it nice and tidy. Okay, looking good. Okay, so now we can actually load the application and kind of click around and we should be able to create, read, and update and delete an artist. Now, in order to do this, first we have to run our migration file, which basically serializes and runs our table here. So let's open up our terminal and run on node migration. Also make sure you're on the right directory. I'm in the root directory where you can find migration file. If you're inside your API.js file folder, it will not give you an error. So navigate up to your root directory, run node migration, and then let's start the app by running node server. Now, in order to actually see the interface in the front end, you gotta copy the path of your index.html file and then set it up in your Google Chrome and copy and paste it right there. So I just had it loaded already. Make sure your server is running, and you can see that this is actually Morgan running. So Morgan is logging our route handling, so you can see the usefulness of this. So you can see API, our Sirius is not being set up yet, so we got a 404 for that, but we got a 200 for our artists, so we're able to actually retrieve them. So let's go ahead and add an artist. I'm gonna type in some dummy data here. Carlos, date of birth. I'm just gonna type in the year, biography, amateur, artist. Let's go ahead and save that. And let's go back and see if our artist was saved. And you can see we can actually read our artist, see the information. We can delete him as well. And we can go back and see that he's gone. And it's looking pretty good, guys. So I believe this should be working. So let's go ahead and let's close our project directory here. And let's go ahead and run our tests. So kill the server here and run npm test and see if we're able to create and delete an artist. And the delete should be the last thing we did. So we're able to create, we're able to read, create, update, and delete an artist. So that was successfully able to actually manage the artist. So we're going to do a similar thing, but this time we're actually going to be working with seriouses and issues, because remember, we're working with comic books here. So the comic books will have seriouses as well. So we're going to be working with our next table now. So let's clear the terminal. I'll minimize that, and we'll move on to the next step. Okay, now we're going to create a series table now. Okay, let's move on to the series table here. So now we can open our migration file, and we're going to write a code to create a new table called series if one doesn't already exist. So the table should have an ID, a name, and a description, and these are all required. Okay, so let's go back to our project here and open migrations. I already have it open over here. Make sure you're writing this, run this query inside your serialized function. As I said before, we want our queries to be in sequence and in order. So we're going to do that right after we create an artist table. So let's go ahead below that. Let's go ahead and create our series table. So we're going to call dbrun to execute the query. We're going to create a table if it doesn't exist. Create table if not exists. We're going to call it serious. Here we go. And let's open up a new line over here. Let's call it, we're going to call in the next row is going to be called ID. So make sure you use your backticks for these identifiers. And then we're going to make sure it's an integer and it's not null because it's required. Let's pass into the next line. We're going to pass in the next identifier, which was name, I believe. Name and description. So name will be text. It will also be not null. And we're going to add in the last one, which is description. This will be description. Make sure you're not using caps for the row names here. Description. It will be text, not null. Okay, looking good. And lastly, we got to specify what is a primary key. The primary key will be the ID, and it's in this case. Primary key will be our ID. Make sure it's not caps. It's a little hard to type this right now. Okay, there we go. And we also have to close in the parentheses for the whole query. This is the one for just the ID. Okay, that's looking good. And just in case you didn't know, we're just using string concatenation in here, so we can type in the SQL query and Basically one line, but it's a little tighter to write it when we're using JavaScript. Okay, and yeah, oh, and let me just correct this typo here. Okay, save that, and let's see what we have to do next. Now we can simply go on to step 37. We're going to run migration via the command line, and then we're going to use DB browser to ensure that our table is properly set up. And then we're going to examine the table properties by inserting data into the table. And when you think your table is ready, we're going to run the test route. So just like we did with the artist table. So let's go ahead and open up our terminal here. We're going to run migration. I have a window open with my DB browser already set up. So I'm going to open a database. It's inside my Codecademy, and it's my SQLite table. You can see we have our series table here, so we can browse our data. And you see I have some previous data that we actually inserted already. So that seems to be working well. If I go into the series table, I can type in some records here. Let's type in actually an actual ID here. I'll type it as one, name, description. We'll set up a new record. It seems to be working properly and fine. So let's go on and run our testing here. So let's go npm test and see if our series table was able to be created. Oh, like I said before, if you're running your DB browser table here, make sure you exit it because your SQL table is open and it's not able to actually run it on both the testing side and this side. So we have to stop our DB browser, close it. Let's not save anything there, and let's run our test one more time. Okay, let's go ahead and scroll all the way to the top. We have our series table, and it was able to create it. It should exist. It has an ID and all the fields that are appropriate data types, and has a required name column, and it has a required description column. Okay, so that seems to be working, and I'm just going to close this and make a little bit more space here, and then we can move on forward to the next step, where we're going to create the routes for the series now. Okay, so now we're going to add our API series routes. So we're going to create a series.js file inside the API directory, and we're going to create and export an express router and import that into the API.js and then mount at series. Okay, so let's go into our folder here. Make sure you save everything, and let's open up the terminal. Go into our API folder, and then we're going to touch series.js. I'm going to close that up. Make sure it's on the proper place. We are in the API directory, and there's a series.js file. We're going to create an express. We're going to require express. Then we're going to create a router called series router, which is equal to a class call from express. We got to export that router, module.export equals series router. Then we have to import that in our API file, just like we did with our artist router. We can simply import it as series router equals require. We have to navigate to that specific file, and we have it over there. Since we're in the same directory as the API, we can just simply grab it from the same directory. And then we have to mount it. So right below our artist router, we can call API router here. We simply say use, and we're going to prepend so we can know that any URL route that starts with series will be handled by the series router. Okay, go ahead and save that, and it's looking good. So let's go back into step 39 now. So in step 39, we're going to open a SQLite 3 database to our database or the provided test database. So just like we did over here at the top, I'm simply just going to grab these lines here. So we're going to create a database, and we're going to make sure that we first use a test database so it doesn't conflict with our actual real database here. So in our series over here at the top, we're going to pass it in right after our series router creation. Save that, and let's move on to step 40. For step 40, we're going to add a get handler at / that will retrieve all existing series from the database. So all errors should be properly handled, and successfully retrieved series should be returned on the series property of the response object with a 200 status code. And when you think route is ready, we could run the testing suite to check our work. So this is going to be very similar. Once you've done a CRUD operation kind of path and routing, you can kind of mimic it. It's not good. There are slight differences to different routes because we're going to be handling certain data different ways. But creating, the reading, and the updating of certain routes is going to be quite similar. For the reading, for example, we're going to run a SQL query that retrieves information from a table. And we're going to do the same for like post request to actually update a table and deleting and updating. So think of the same logic, look back in your artist file if it didn't make sense, and kind of like go through the same code to try to overlook how we're going to be writing the series routes over here. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to go into series router. We're going to start our get function here to the /. We're going to pass in our callback function with request, response, and next. And we're going to execute certain function here. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to actually retrieve all the series from the table series. So we can call db.all and pass in the SQL query, which will be select everything from the table series, and then pass in the callback function. As we know, the first parameter in that callback function will be error, and then the following will be all the rows retrieved. Inside this callback function, we're going to do some error handling and some series handling, which I believe we have to do for this one specifically. So we're going to do the same thing we've been doing. If there's an error, we're going to pass that error into the next middleware function. So we'll pass that error with next. Otherwise, we can send a status code of 200 and simply pass in as a JSON call all the series that we were able to retrieve. Okay, looking good. So let's open up our terminal and just test this out. Make sure that we are able to retrieve all the series. Let's see if we actually grabbed it. Let's scroll all the way up. We got the artist, and here we go. There's two tests we have for the API series as get request. We get a 200 for API series, and we're able to return all the series, and we're able to return a status code of 200. Okay, that's looking good. Let's close the terminal. There we go, and move on to the next step. Step 41, we're going to add a router parameter for handling the series ID parameter, and this router parameter should retrieve the specified series from the database and attach it as series on the request object. If a series with that ID does not exist, we're going to add a 404 response to the response, and then when you think your route is ready, we're going to run the test suite to check our work. Okay, back into our series.js file, we're going to be writing this parameter function here at the top because we want to make sure this is the first thing that was being read when we go into different URLs. So series router.param. What is the name of this parameter? We're going to call it series ID. We're going to pass in 4 parameters into this callback function: the request, the response, next, and the actual value of series ID. And inside here, we're going to be a callback function. So what we have to do is actually find out the series ID and retrieve information from that single series. So we got to use a SQL query that has a name parameter for series ID. So let's throw that in a variable called SQL, and we're going to pass in the query right here. So select everything from series where series ID.id is equal to the named parameter series ID. And here we got to pass in, we got to specify what is the series ID name parameter. So we're going to store that in an object, and then we can pass that as a value in the second parameter when we call .dbget. So the key property will be series ID, and the value will actually be series ID that we grabbed from this parameter here. And then we can actually run db.get, which will retrieve a row itself. So db.get, we pass in the SQL query, the values for the name parameters, and a callback function which has error as its first parameter, and then the actual rows that were retrieved. The single row that was retrieved. Now we do some error handling. So if there was an error, you guessed it, we're going to pass that error to our next middleware function. If there is no error, first we got to check if there is a series, and we attach that series to our request object, which is request series, attach it as series on the request object. And if a series with the ID, with a series with that specific ID does not exist, then we send a 404 back to the server. So else if series, so if it does exist, then we're going to attach it to the request.series object. And then make sure you actually call next, because we're using a param handling function over here. So we got to trickle this down into the next actual route handler. and we got to send a 404 status code if if it wasn't able to find an artist series with that ID that was passed in the URL. So let's go ahead and type in res.send status 404. So if someone tries to go to the website and tries to go to series 7 and our database only holds 6 series, then we're going to send a 404. Okay, let's go ahead and save that. Okay, looking good. Now we can move on to step 42, where we're actually going to run and add a get to our series ID route. So this route should return the retrieved series on the request object with the 200 status code. And when you think your route is ready, we're going to run the test route to check our work. Okay, so let me unclick this, and we're going to move to our project back here. Right below our get request for all the series, we're going to write our specific series router for a specific series ID. So series router router.get, we're going to pass in the parameter for series ID, and then we're going to pass in our request, our response, and then our next middleware. After that, we're going to pass in the status of 200 and attach a JSON object with the value of request.series, which was retrieved from the param function that we have over here. So whenever we receive series ID, this code will be run, and it will be able to run the SQL query and attach the result row into the request.series object. So all we really need to do right now is simply send a status of 200 and attach a JSON object where the key property will be series and the value will be request series. So this makes it very easy to handle any kind of name parameters if we already have this param object, param function created, middleware created. Okay, save that. And now let's open our terminal and run npm tests. Okay, and let's go and see if we're able to actually retrieve API series with a specific ID. It seems to be passing. We're trying out with 2. So remember, we're using our test database already. So in our test database, there's already some information set into our tables. So we're able to actually retrieve one for a series that has the ID of 2. We're actually able to return a 200 status code for that series. And for one that doesn't exist, which we're going to series/9999, there's invalid, so we send a status code of 404. Okay, that seems to be working great. So let's clear out the terminal and minimize it. And we can move forward to step 43. Now we're going to do a post request route. For a post request route, the route should return a 400 response if any required fields are missing. In this case, it will only be name or description. Otherwise, it should add a new series to the database and return the newly created series with a 201 status code, handling any errors along the way. So when we're done with that, we can check if it's working, running our tests. So right after our get for the series ID parameter, let's start by running our series router.post handler here. We're going to do it to the /. We're going to send in our callback function with the request, response, and next. Execute the query right over here. So first we want to check if the name and the description exist in the request body.series. So if request, first let's call this name. We'll set it to request body.series.name. We'll do the same for our description. Make sure it's equal to request body.series.description. And we want to check if either of them don't exist, and we send a status of code of 400. So if name doesn't exist or description doesn't exist, then we're going to send a status code. And make sure you have your return as well, because we want to terminate the execution of the function. I'm going to stop and send a status code of 400. So response send status 400. Okay, perfect. If those information is actually provided, then we run our SQL query like we did with the previous post request for our artist. Let's save our SQL query in a variable called SQL, and this will have 2 named variables, which will be name and description. So the query we're going to do, we're going to insert into the series table. We're going to insert into specifically the name and the description row, and we're going to pass the values that were provided from the post request. So let's go ahead and insert into series. We're going to pass in name, description, The values will be name parameters here, so name and description, and that's it for the SQL query. Now we got to specify the values themselves. So let's create an object. We're going to create an object with name, and description as well will be the variable that we actually grabbed from the request. Description right here. Okay, cool. So next thing we have to do is simply run the SQL query. And remember, once again, db.run simply runs a SQL query. So we have to actually grab the row itself by running db-get if we're able to insert into this series table. So we're going to pass in SQL, the SQL query, the values for the name parameters, and a function to handle the error, if there is any. So let's go ahead and here. If there is an error, what are we going to do? We're going to pass it with our next function to the middleware, to the next middleware function. Let me add a space here. Oh, yeah. If we're using ES5, which is a function name, we don't need to use arrow functions here. If there is no error, we can simply run, we can retrieve the row we just inserted into the series. So how do we do that? Well, remember what we did for the artist. We have SQL has a useful keyword that's called last ID, which grabs the last inserted row from the table that was recently updated. So we can call db.get, and we can pass in the query here, which will be select everything from the series where the series.id is equal to, this will be this, which is referring to the last row inserted, and we're grabbing the last ID of that row. And remember, we still have to pass in a callback function here to handle any error, if there's any, and to handle the actual series row if we are able to retrieve it. So if we're able to retrieve it, we want to send a status code of 201. And we also want to attach the actual row as a JSON object so that it can be parsed and displayed to the user. And then we can save that. So make sure you add your semicolons here. Okay, that looks good to me. So let's go ahead and open the terminal and run npm test and see if our test is passing here. So let's scroll up towards our post request for the API series, and here we go. We are able to create a valid series. We're able to return a 201 status code after a series creation, and we're able to return the newly created series after a series creation. And we'll also return a 400 status code for any invalid series. So if there is no name or no description, we're able to send a status code of 400. Okay, the logic for this seems to be working. So next thing we need to do is make sure we can update a series, and then we can delete a series as well. So let's move on to the next step, which is step 44 over here. Now we're going to add put request to series ID route. So let's see what we need to do. We need to return a 400 response if any required fields are missing. Otherwise, it should add a new series to the database and return the newly updated series with a 200 status code, handling any errors along the way. When you think our route is ready, we're going to run our testing suite to check our work. Okay, let's go back to our app here. And we're going to do this right below our post request, so right under it. We're going to start by running here our series router dot put, and like I said, similar to the artist as well. So we're going to pass in the name parameter, our callback function with the request, a response, and next. Inside here, we're going to check if there is a name and a description. So let's actually copy this here because we're actually using the same kind of sort of validation to make sure they exist. Okay, so if those exist, if either of those don't exist, we're sending a status code of 400. If they do exist, then we have to update our table. So let's store our SQL query here in a variable called SQL. We're going to update our series table, and we're going to set the name and the description to the named variables. So let's go ahead and type in set. We're going to pass in the name, which will be equal to the named variable name. Then we're going to set also the description to be equal to the named variable description. And I'm going to add a new line here. And let's add in, we have to specify which exact series we're updating, because we can't update all the series to the same name and description. So we need a where clause here to specify what series, and we can specify that by grabbing the ID, and we'll set that equal to the series ID name parameter. Series ID. Okay, perfect. So let's go below that and make a new object called values that holds the information about these name parameters. So name will obviously be name. Description will be description. Description, not describe, description. And lastly, series ID will be series ID. Series ID, here we go. Okay, looking good. Save that. Now we have to run the SQL query and check if there was an error. And if it wasn't an error, then we can actually grab the row that was updated. So let's go ahead and db.run the SQL query with the values, and let's pass in a callback function that handles the error. So if there is an error, we want to pass that into the next middleware function. So next error. If there isn't an error, else we want to retrieve the row that we just updated. So we're going to use db.get to actually retrieve it. We're going to use template literals because we are going to grab the series ID from the URL. So we're going to grab and select everything from the series where series.id is equal to the rec.params.seriesID. Looking good. And when we call dbget, we're also passing a callback function here. So let's make sure we don't forget that. And that callback function will have two parameters, the error and the series. And we have to do some error handling here. Actually, we're just going to pass in, if there's no error, we're going to pass in the status code of 200 and attach the JSON object key property. So res.status will be sent with 200. And let's also chain the JSON object containing the series that we just updated. Okay, that's a lot of code, but it's quite similar in the same pattern for the previous node we wrote. Okay, so let's go ahead and open the terminal and run our tests. And there seems to be an error here actually. So let's see what the problem is. Series ID is not defined. Let's see what line. It's on the series.js file, line 73. So let's go up to line 73. And okay, so remember, we're actually grabbing the series ID from the URL here. We're not setting it as a variable. So this should be a parameter. So all we need to do is actually type in request.params.seriesID. Okay, go ahead and save that. Let's open up our terminal again and run npm test and see if we're able to update our series. Okay, there we go. We're able to update a series with a given ID. We're able to return a 200 status code after the series was updated. And we're able to return the updated series after series update. And lastly, we return a 400 status code for invalid series. So you can see that we're actually all updating the first series here. So if we to look in our test database, you'll see that this one has been updated as well. Okay, let's clear out our terminal here. Now we can interact with the actual app itself. So we're going to be loading it, same thing we did last time. And we're going to try what we did with the artist, but this time we're going to do it with the series itself. So open up your terminal again, run node migration in order to create the table itself. And you can see I'm in the wrong directory because I'm inside API. So let's go up once more, go to migration. Once you run that, let's open up your project structure here. I'm going to copy the path. I'm going to go into a new Google Chrome window. And I'm going to copy my path here. I guess I didn't copy it correctly. What's the problem here? Copy path. There we go. Let's copy the path. And also make sure you're running the actual server. So, because that's just loading the template of the HTML. It's not really making it dynamic. So make sure you refresh this. Okay, there we go. So let's go ahead and add a series. And you can take a look at your terminal here. Morgan should be logging. So last time we went to series API, we were getting a 400. But now that we actually created the route handling, it's successfully giving us a 200 status code. So let's create a series. Let's call it Spider-Man Strikes Back, I guess. Spider-Man Strikes Back will be the description. Let's save it. Let's go back. We can't add an issue yet. So let's go back into the series, and there we go. We can see we can probably update it. save it, go back and see that we have changed the title. Oh, let me go back forward. And there we go. And let's lastly just delete it to make sure that it's being deleted. Let's go and refresh this. Let's go ahead. Oh, we haven't deleted. Seems that we haven't actually set up the route for deletion. Okay, so we still need to do that. No problem. We actually look at the instructions. They're telling us that we're going to be waiting to write the delete for the series ID route until we've added issues, because each comic book will have issues. If you're familiar with comic books, for example, Spider-Man has like 300 issues, and there's another version of Spider-Man that has other issues itself. So, but everything else seems to be working with our series ID. So let's go ahead and terminate the application. Let's go back and clear the terminal as well and minimize it. And let's move on to step 45. So now we're going to create the issues table. So we're going to move on to the last model. We're going to open migration and write a code to create a new table called issue if one doesn't already exist. So the table will have the following column properties: ID, name, issue number, publication date, artist ID, and series ID. Notice that artist ID and series ID have a foreign key, which is basically referring to the previous table. We have an artist ID that's going to be referring to the artist table, and the series ID is going to be referring to the series table. So if you're familiar with relational databases, this basically means that the issue has a relation to both the artists and the series table, and the artist and the series table are kind of feeding their information through their IDs into the issue table. So many issues will have many artist IDs, and many issues will have a lot of series IDs as well. So let's go back to our migration file over here, and we're going to create our new table here. So let's go up a couple of make a new line here, and we're going to start by writing our new SQL query here. Okay, so first thing we're going to do, maybe make some space here, is create a table if it doesn't exist, or create table if not exists. We're going to call it issue. Make sure you open up the parentheses to what we're going to be fitting into this creation of the table. Let's add a new line here, and let's make some space. There we go. Okay, this will hold the first identifier will be ID. We're going to make sure that it's an integer and that it's not null. Let's make a new line here. Next thing we'll have to add is name, I believe, name. And this will be name. This will be text, and it will be not null. New line. Let's add also an issue number. Issue number. This will be integer. Integer, not null. Let me look quickly back into what we need. Publication date, artist ID, and series ID. We have to actually specify that they're foreign keys as well. So issue number, we need artist ID, which will be, sorry, publication date first, publication date, which will be a text, not null. One more line. Let's add the artist ID now. So artist ID. The artist ID will be an integer, not null, so it's required. We also need to add series ID, which is an integer, not null. Now we have to specify what are the primary keys and what are the foreign keys. So for the primary key, we're going to use the ID. Close that up. For the foreign key, we have to actually specify with the name of the foreign key, which row is a foreign key, and then we add a keyword called reference and specify the table and the actual row from that table that's going to be the referred to it. So foreign key, parentheses, let's specify it's going to be the artist ID row. Then we're going to add references to say which table it's going to reference. So we're going to reference artist, and which row from that table we're going to reference. So make sure you actually wrap each the table in its own backticks, and the same with the actual row itself. So it will be ID. Okay, and we also have to pass in the foreign key for the series ID. So we're going to pass in foreign key for the series ID. And we're gonna do references, the serious, typing tab instead of backticks, serious, and in parentheses, oh my God, let's type in the ID, which will be the ID of the series as well. Okay, that's good. Let's also close the parentheses for the whole query, which is this, and the parentheses for the db.run function. Okay, I believe that's it. Okay, we can move on to step 46 now. So now we're going to run migration through the command line and use DB browser to ensure that a table was properly set. And when you think your table is ready, we're going to run the testing suite. So let's go back to our project here and open up the terminal. Let's run node migration. Once it's migrated, we can go up and open our DB browser. So I'll go to my new window here. I'll open DB browser. Let's load our database as well. Okay, we'll go to Code Academy, right over here. So you can see we actually have the issues table. We can see the schema for it. It has the ID. We have the foreign keys for artist ID and serious ID. Now to test if it's working properly, I want to show other features for DB browser. So I'm going to go ahead and actually execute some SQL in here. So we're going to insert into issue. We're going to insert certain values. So we're going to insert ID. We're going to insert name. We're going to insert issue number. We're going to insert our publication date. Let's insert the artist ID as well. Let's also insert serious ID. You can see the actual schema here below. Serious ID. And now we can pass in certain values. So the values, I'm going to just do some dummy data here. We'll pass in the ID for 1. This will be the name of the issue, Spider-Man 43. Let's do publication date. An issue number. We'll do issue number 1. Publication date is a string, so we'll wrap it in quotes. We'll do artist ID for 1 and series ID for 1. Go ahead and execute that. And we can see that the query was executed successfully by passing in the following data. And it seems to be working totally fine. So let's go ahead and let's run our test as well to make sure that the table is properly grabbing the right requirements. And I always forget this. Let me terminate the test. We're going to exit DB browser. Let's not save anything there. Let's go ahead and npm test. We're almost done, guys. Let's go up to the top and we see that our issues table is successfully being created and it has all the required row names. Okay, we'll clear the terminal, minimize this, and we'll move on to the next step. Okay, now we're going to create our issues routes. So for the routes this time, we're going to add our API serious ID, and issues routes. So look how it's nested and actually depending. The serious ID, the issues are dependent on the serious ID. So we got to go to our API directory and create an issues.js file and export an express router on that, and then import that router onto the series and mount it on serious ID/issues. Since you'll need to access information about the specified series from the issues router, we're gonna have to merge parameters. So we're gonna have to add a parameter when we create a router class. We're gonna add a parameter into that so we can actually merge certain parameters. So let's go back to our project here. Let's open up the terminal. Let's navigate to CD API. Let's make sure that we have all our files there, and we're gonna touch issues.js. And then let's get rid of this, and of course double check that it's created in the right directory. So we have issues. We're going to go to the top and we're going to import Express. After that, we're going to create a router for issues router. So we're going to call it issues router. Set that equal to express.router. So here we can actually pass in a parameter that's part of an object. It's called merge params. So think of this as kind of like the child router of Sirius. So inside Sirius, we're going to pass in issues. So this will basically allow the parameters to be merged so that they can be read from Sirius back into issues as well. Okay, so next thing we have to do is actually export this. Module.exports issues router. And then we can go into our series file and actually mount certain routes into here. So after our setting up our database, let's go ahead and create a variable called issues router. So we're going to import the actual router. Since we're in the same directory, you can simply import issues.js. And we want to write the mounting right after the param series ID because we want to merge the parameters. So we want to be able to access this series ID parameter, and then we can feed that into our actual issues router. Without it, we won't be able to actually feed it into it. So series router .use, and we're first gonna grab the series ID parameter. So let's go into here. Remember the / before that. So series ID, and then we can go into issues. And we're going to be calling issues router as our router handler, which will be running in our handlers for that. Okay, looking good. Let's go ahead and save that, and we can move forward to step 48. So for step 48 for issues, we're going to add a get handler for the / that will retrieve all existing issues of the specified series from the database. All errors should be properly handled, and successfully retrieved issues should be returned on the issues property of the response object with a 200 status code. And once we think our handler is ready, we can run our testing to check our work. So we have to do a few steps before we get started with writing our handler. First thing we need to do is import SQLite and set up our database the same way we've been doing. So I'm going to go ahead and grab these two variables here and paste them into our issues router. So go ahead and save that. And next thing we're going to do the first get request to /. So issues router.get. We're going to pass in our callback function here. Request, response, and next. Inside this callback function, we're going to run a SQL query. The SQL query will basically grab, first we need to grab what the series ID is. And since we're actually feeding, this is being fed from the series router, since we actually have this parameter function middleware that is able to be fed into the URL, we can simply grab that from the rec params.series ID, so we have access to that. So let's go ahead and select everything. Select everything from the table issue, where issue.series ID, remember we're going to access the foreign key here, is equal to the name parameter series ID. And now we have to set up the value. So the value for this will be equal to series ID, which is the name parameter, is going to be set to, like I said, the rec.params from the URL, series ID. So remember that this is actually happening from the series kind of router. Okay, looking good. Next thing we need to do is run and execute a query to grab all the rows that have all the issues. So we can do db all SQL values and then a callback function that will handle the error and all the issues if it is successfully grabbing them. So if there's an error, we're going to pass that into our next middleware to feed it into the error handler. Otherwise, we're going to call res.status200 and then chain a JSON call method with our issues object containing all the issues that we retrieved. Okay, that looks good. Let's go ahead and open up right here our terminal and run our tests. So we should see a few tests failing here for a series ID, but for the ones for get, here we go. We successfully were able to create all the issues that are fed into our series ID and all the issues from that actual series ID. Okay, that's looking good. Let's clear this out. We're almost getting there. I know it's been a long project. Okay, we're going to work on our post request now. So this post request should return a 400 if any required fields are missing. We're going to check for name, issue number, publication date, or artist ID. Then we're going to check the route should return a 400 response if an artist with a provided artist ID does not exist. Otherwise, it should add the new issue to the database and return the newly created series with the 201 status code, which will handle any errors along the way. When the route is ready, we're going to run the testing suite to check our work. Okay, so let's go back into our issues file over here. And right at the bottom, we're going to start writing our post request. So same as the other ones we have been doing, Let's go ahead and do issues router.post. We're going to be calling the forward slash on this router. We're going to pass in the callback function with a request, response object, and next. After that, we're going to check that each of the following variables are actually in the form. So we're going to check for name, issue number, publication date, and artist ID. So name, body from the issue, name, we want the issue number, and I'm actually just going to grab and copy this request body.issue since we're going to be using it quite a bit. Issue number, we want the publication date, publication date. We also want the artist ID as well. ID equal to artist ID. Okay, good. So for the post request, we're gonna first grab, we have to do two things first. Since our issues table has a relation to both series and an artist table, we first need to grab the artist information. So we have to run a query that will select all the information from an artist with a specific artist ID. After that, we can actually insert into the issues table the values that we have stored from there, and then we can grab a series ID from there. So let's first run a SQL query to get the information from the artist. I'm going to store this in an artist SQL variable, and I'm going to set that equal to select everything from artist where artist.id is equal to a named variable artist ID. Then we're going to make an object called artist values that will be basically the values for the named parameter. So artist values will equal to the object where we specify the named parameter as the property and the artist ID as the actual value. So now we can actually run the query and retrieve information about the artist, because we want to make sure that there is that the artist has already a series created. So we're going to insert an issue into that series as well. Okay, so let's first get the artist. So db.get, we're going to pass in the SQL query. Then we're going to pass in the artist values. After that, we're going to pass a callback function. Now, if there's an error, we're going to pass that into our handler. So next error. Otherwise, now here we have to check first if we retrieve data from the artist. We want to make sure that there's a name, the issue number, and the publication, all this information that we grabbed from the parameter, from the form. So I'm going to make sure that if there's no name, if there's no issue number, or if there's no publication date, or if there's no artist, then we're going to return status code of 400. So let's go over and attach that to a response object. So response and status 400. Okay, looking good. So let's say we were able to retrieve information about the artist, and now we can actually insert this into the issues table. So we have access to the actual series ID from the params. So remember, we have the params here at the top. Now we have the params, and now we were able to retrieve the artist ID. So we have both informations regarding the ID of the artist and the ID of the series. Without those IDs, we would not be able to actually insert anything into issues. And just realized I missed an if statement right here. So there we go. Okay, so if that was successful and there's a name, issue number, publication date, and artist, let's go ahead and run the query. So let's go ahead. We're going to type in SQL as a variable. We're going to insert into issue. We're going to insert the name, the issue number, the publication date, the artist ID, which we just retrieved, and the series ID, which we are grabbing from the parameter from the URL. Let's also add in what would be the values. So the values for those rows are going to be name, issue number, publication date, artist ID and series ID. Okay, that looks good. Now we have to actually set the values. So let's create another object called values, and in here we're going to pass in the actual values for all those parameters. So name will be name, issue number will be issue number, publication date will be publication date, artist ID will be artist ID, series ID will be, we're going to grab the series ID from the series ID parameter, because remember the route we're going to has the series ID in the URL. So we can simply grab it from rec params.series ID. Okay, and that will be the values. And now we can run the query itself. So let's go a little further down here and run the query with dbrun. Remember, this will only execute the quote, so we still need to actually grab the information. So we're going to pass in the query, we're going to grab the values, and then we're going to pass in a callback function that handles the error. Inside here, if there's an error, we're going to pass that to the middleware. Keep forgetting, if you're using ES6, that you don't use, if you're using ES5, you don't use arrow functions. Okay, so if there's an error, we're going to pass that into the next middleware. If there's not an error, then we're going to actually grab the row. So let's go ahead and use dbget to grab a single row. We need interpolation because we're going to use the last ID attribute that SQL provides. So we're going to select everything from the recently updated row in issue. So issue where issue.id is equal to the last inserted row, the ID of the last inserted row. Okay, and make sure to also pass in your callback function as a second parameter. I like to put it in the new line. And those will have two parameters, error and the row that was retrieved, which in our case is an issue. Okay, let's go ahead in here. We're going to return a status of 201. And chain in, you guessed it, JSON object that will contain the issue that we just created. Okay, that's a hefty post request, but if you look at the pattern, it's almost identical to what we did with artist. All we did here first is we actually grabbed the artist information, because we actually need their ID in order to update and insert a row into our issues table. So let's look over here, and now we can run our test. So we'll go back in here, and noticed typo right there. Go ahead and save that. And let's open up our terminal and run our npm test. See if our gets are working here. So we got a database that was locked here for a second because I just had my DB browser open, but the rest seem to be working fine. So now we can actually start working with specific updating certain issues. So let's go ahead and clear this out. Let's minimize the terminal and we'll move on to the next step. Okay, now we're going to add a router param for issue ID, and this param should check to see if an issue with a supplied issue ID exists. If so, it should continue to the next middleware function and the middleware stack. Okay, so let's go back to our folder here for file, and we're gonna go all the way to the top of our issues, and here we're gonna do what we did, kind of similar to our param series router here, what we did here. So you can even copy paste it and kind of just replace the name parameters and placeholders, but let's go ahead and type it out from scratch. Let's go out to the top, right above our get handler for all the issues. We're going to type in issues router dot param. We're going to name this issue ID. After that, we're going to pass in the callback function. Next, issue ID. And then we're going to execute some function here to actually manage all of this. Okay, so first thing we need to do is we need to grab information about the issue ID, because this whole basically parameter that we're going to be grabbing will be just attaching an issue ID and passing it over down to the next route handler. So it will be a SQL query. So let's store a SQL query into our variable SQL. Let's select everything from issue, where issue issue.id is equal to issue ID. Then we're going to grab the values, which is an object. We're going to specify the key property, which will be the name parameter, issue ID. We'll grab the value, will be issue ID as well. Okay, now we can go ahead and run our db.get to pass in our issue to the next handler. So let's go ahead and db.get, we'll pass in the query, the values for the name parameters, and our callback function, which will handle the issue itself and an error if it finds one. So first thing we'll need to do is handle the error. If there's an error, we're going to pass it down towards our error handler, and if not, else if there is an issue found, we're going to just pass it down to the next route handler. And if there's no issue found over there, then we're going to add a last else statement and just simply send a status code of 400. So send status of 400. Okay, there we go. Go ahead and save that as well. And we'll move forward. Now we can use this new param to actually work with our put request. So we're going to add a put issue ID. This route should return a 400 response if any required fields are missing, and that includes our name, issue number, publication date, or artist ID. Additionally, the route should return a 400 response if an artist with a provided artist ID does not exist. And otherwise, it should update the issue in the database and return a newly updated series with a 200 status code, and we're going to be handling errors along the way. Then we can run our test suite to make sure it's all working. So let's go to the bottom of our file here. Right after our post request, we're going to start writing our issues router. There we go. We're going to type in .put. We're going to pass in our issue ID. Let's pass in a callback function. And inside the callback function, we got to check for four things, which we can actually grab from here because we're both going to be checking for the artist ID first. So let's grab all this information from the top. And let me just double check that we're actually grabbing the artist ID for the put. Yes, because we need the artist ID in order to actually update an issue. After that, we can call db.get, pass in our artist SQL, our SQL query, pass in the artist values, and then we're going to do the callback function, error artist. Inside here, we're going to do the error handling first. If there's an error, we're going to pass that down with next. Otherwise, we want to check if any of the attributes are missing. So we're going to check if there is no name, or if there's no issue number, or if there's no publication date, or if there is no artist. Any of those are not inserted, then we're going to return and we're going to send a status code of 400 to the response object. So send status 400. Looking good. And now we can actually run our query where we're going to be updating our issues table. So our SQL query over here is going to be a little bit different, but it's essentially the same logic. So we're going to type in const SQL, store that in the variable. We're going to update our issue table. We're going to set the name to be equal to the name parameter name. Issue number will be equal to issue number. Let's make a new line here so it's a little nicer, easier to read. We'll write publication date. Publication date will be equal to publication date. Artist ID will be equal to artist ID. Let's add one more line. Let's do the where clause now. Since we're actually going to update an issue, we have to figure out where the issue ID is. And since we actually define our param here, a little param handler here, we can grab it from the params. So let's go ahead and type in our where clause, where the AD, the ID is equal to a name parameter issue ID, which we're going to be grabbing from the params. So let's go ahead and make a values object to store all the information and set the values for all these parameters. So name will be name, issue number will be issue number, publication date will be publication date, artist ID, and then issue ID will be equal to request params dot issue ID, because we have, once again, we're able to actually grab it from the params itself since we set that handy function there. Okay, so now we can run the query to actually grab the last issue that was recently updated, the last updated row. So let's go behind after this. And let's go ahead and run the query with dbrun, the SQL query, the values, and our function that will be running the error. And inside here, we are going to first handle the error. So if there's an error, let's go ahead and pass that error down. Otherwise, we can go ahead and actually retrieve that row. So we're going to call select everything from the issue table where the issue ID is equal to the latest, the last updated one, or actually no, sorry, the request params ID, because we're actually passing that into the URL. So we can actually just grab that params.issue ID. Let's pass the callback function. This will be an error and an issue. And then if we're able to actually find that specified updated issue, then we can simply return it and also send a status code of 200, meaning it was a success, and we'll send the issue as an object. Okay, looking good. So yeah, this is a little different because this is with a post request, we're actually creating a new row and we're returning the latest created row. In this case, we're actually just updating an existing row, so we can just simply grab it from the params and the URL. So it's a little bit different, but it's essentially kind of working in the same kind of way. We're creating a new row in this case, and we're just simply updating a new one in this one. Okay, let's move on. We're almost there. We have a few more steps, 3 steps left. Okay, now we're going to add a delete route. So let's go ahead and create that route. This route should delete an issue with a specified issue ID from the database. The route should handle any errors and send a 204 response upon successful deletion. Okay, and we're going to do that here. Also, make sure you're actually running your test. So let's just run it really quickly to see if we're able to update our serious ID issues over here. And here we go. We are successfully updating a created issue. We have a bunch of the tester that responds, and we're able to return a 200 status code for an issue that was updated, and 404 code for invalid issue IDs that don't exist, or IDs that didn't have, or issues that didn't have the required information. Okay, let's go ahead and clear this out and minimize the terminal, and let's go on and write our latest route, the last one for the issues. So issues router dot delete. Here we're going to actually pass in the issue ID parameter, and we're going to pass in our request, response, and next object, and then a code block to actually know what we're going to end up doing here. Okay, and this is quite actually a more straightforward query because we're just going to delete an existing ID that we can just grab from the parameters. So let's type in our SQL query here, and this will be just delete from issue where the issue ID is equal to a name parameter issue ID, and we're going to have to set a value for that name parameter for that issue ID parameter. We'll set it to the request params.issue ID. Good. And then we can just run the query. So we're going to pass in our SQL query, the values, and our callback function that handles the error over here. And here, if there's an error, we want to pass that error down to our middleware. Otherwise, we want to just send a status code of 204. So send the status of 204. Save that. And let's go ahead and run our test. So let's go back here. Let's open up our terminal. Run npm test. Seems there's an error here. Values is not defined on line 116. Value. Oh, it's because we're labeling it values. Let's call it value. Save that and run that again. And there we go. We're able to delete. So we have 68 passing and two failing, and these are depending from the series actually. So we're gonna go ahead and implement the last function, and let's go ahead and resume. Okay, so lastly, we're gonna write our delete for the series ID route. So in series.js, we're gonna delete parameter on the series ID route, which is gonna delete a whole series. This route should check to ensure that the specified series has no related issues in the database. And, oh, sorry. And if it does, the handler should return a 400 response. If not, the handler should delete the series from the database and send a 204 response. So let's go back here. Let's clear out the terminal, minimize it, and let's go into our series file. We're going to do it all the way at the bottom. So let's go down here. We're going to write series router router.delete. We're going to pass in the parameter of series ID, the callback function, request, response, and next. So what we need to do now is to grab the series ID that's attached to our issues, to the issue itself. So each issue will have a series ID attached to it. So we need to first grab the issue with the SQL ID. So we're going to store this in a variable called issue SQL. And here we're going to actually select everything from the issue where the series ID is equivalent to the series ID that's attached to this parameter here. Okay, so let's go ahead and select everything from the issue table where it's the series ID of that issue is equal to the parameter that we passed in the URL. So the series ID from that issue, remember we're using the foreign key from that relational table, is equal to the name parameter series ID, which we're going to grab from the parameter of the URL. So let's set the value for that issue value will be equal to, let's call it issue values just in case we have to add anything else. The name parameter, series ID, and then we can just call request, not that, oops, sorry guys. I have snippets on my Visual Studio Code, so it tends to do that. Request.params.seriesID. And now we can actually get that first. So remember, we're deleting all the issues from that series. So the specified series has no related issues, so we got to get rid of all the issues that were within that series. So let's go ahead and run that query. We're going to pass in the issue SQL, our issue values, our error, our issue. I'm going to use a callback function right there with our error and our issue. Of course, if there's an error, we're going to call next error. Otherwise, if there's an can't find a issue, we're going to send a status code of 400. So we want to make sure that the handler returns a 400 response if we can find a related issue in that database. So we're going to send status 400 because we don't want any issues to be returned from the series. So we want to send just a 400. So if it actually finds a series right there with that ID, we're going to grab, now we can run a query to actually delete that specific series. So from the issue, we can grab the series and we can pass in our SQL query to delete everything from that series, which we grab from the ID. So let's go ahead and create our SQL query. We're going to call it delete SQL, which will be equal to delete from series, where series.id is equal to the name parameter series ID. After that, let's create the name parameter. So let's create an object here, delete values, which will be equal to series ID. The value will be grabbed from the actual parameter here. So request.params.series ID. Okay, now we can actually run this query. So let's go ahead and call dbrun delete SQL. Let's pass in the values. Callback function to if there's an error. Let me make some space here. Okay, and if there's an error, we're going to pass that into our middleware. Otherwise, we have successfully deleted the series, so we can just simply send a status code. Send status, I believe it's 204. Okay, looks good. Okay, let's look up the instructions again. Last thing we need to do is run our testing suite to check our work. So let's go back in here, open up your terminal, and just type in npm test to run all your testing. And there you go. We have all our tests passing. So you have successfully created an API Express app with a database hookup and created a CRUD app using create, read, update, and delete functions. So looking good. Pat yourself in the back. This is a long project. So you've reached the end. So let's go to the final step. For the final step, we're simply going to seed some data. We have some fake data inside a file called seed.js. So we're going to do it by running node seed.js right over here. So let's go back into our terminal, and at the bottom, let's go ahead and seed our data. Once it's seeded, we can go and interact with the application itself. So let's go ahead and start the application with npm start. Let's open up our directory, and now we're gonna copy in the index.html, copy the path, open a new browser, and copy paste it in there. And you should have example of some dummy data that we have inserted from the CJS file. If you look at CJS file, it is simply some SQL queries that they're running and inserting some data into our database. So if you're getting errors, make sure you have migrated the tables and they're created as well. You can also maybe even delete the database SQL and create it again. But it should be working now, and you should see some dummy data here with two series. One called Spider-Man and the other one called Bashman. Bashman has two issues and Spider-Man doesn't have one. So let's go ahead and create an issue for this one. So let's go ahead and create issue sample, issue number 1, date 1960. Let's go ahead and save that. And let's create another one, name whatever, issue number 2, date 1961. Let's create a new one. There we go. And if you go back to Spider-Man, we can see that we actually updated it. So if we actually delete a series, it should be able to, an issue, it should update it and persist it as well. So it should be all working. And let's go ahead and look at the artist as well. Go ahead and try to just test the functionality. Save this, go back in here, make sure it's updated and it's persisting. Let's go ahead and delete this. Should be able to delete it. So everything seems to be working fine. And this is basically the end of our project here. So pat yourself on the back once again, because this was a lengthy, long series of steps that we did to accomplish this. Now, this is basically a full-fledged app, and we're able to actually do a lot of the stuff that many other different CRUD apps work. The main kind of structure and logic behind all these CRUD apps is essentially the same. In order to create a new post request, we're going to be updating a table and inserting some stuff into it. Sorry, not updating, just inserting different information to that specific table. To update that, we're simply creating, running a SQL query on an endpoint, and we're passing in param IDs. And this is basically the same for most CRUD applications. So the structure and the way they're built is quite similar. Express is very useful and handy in creating middleware functions that we can actually feed into different sections. So if you see in your server file here, you see how our middleware is being used, and the order for this case is actually important because we're gonna work like this Express app kind of works like a Plinko board where it will go into this middleware function, and if there's an error, it will exit and go back into the next one, which is why we use a next callback function here. So it will kind of filter out and stop executing into the next router if it finds an error, and it send it to the error middle handler. You can create other middleware functions to actually feed into certain handlers if you want. Maybe you can find a way to refactor code. Maybe the way we're actually checking if certain values exist. That could be some perhaps middleware function, maybe not. Feel free to navigate and mess around with the application yourself so you can actually look into what you could do or maybe find ways to improve it, because this is kind of like a more of a completed app, but it's basically there's other many features we can do. You can add another error handler, for example. Let's see, right over here. What if we're not able to grab an updated row? We can maybe do an error handler here. If there's an error, maybe pass it into a SQL error handler. So there's many other things you can actually add to this. So feel free to navigate and explore and take a deep dive into trying new different features. But anyway, that concludes our project for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you everyone next time.